Affirmative action programs were created to help level the playing field for underrepresented groups, but how they are implemented in society has been challenged in courts and by the public. The CBSN Originals documentary, The Diversity Dilemma, examines when these measures can be helpful or harmful. Here's a preview.
Part of the thing about affirmative action is, as a black person, you never really know whether it's affecting you. So I just graduated from Columbia University, and I suspect that I would have gotten in if I were white or Asian, but I don't actually know that as a matter of fact.
Affirmative action programs increase access specifically for underrepresented groups. So that's why it's so important.
When I went to Harvard, I knew that affirmative action played a role in my admission. And I thought that was fair because I thought it was bringing me up to the starting line.
There's this myth that it's just about how well you did on a test. And the thing is that merit is much more complicated.
If one school is more concerned about musical ability, fine. What concerns people is preferential treatment based on race.
There's a conundrum in this area of affirmative action. The conundrum is, in order to be totally successful, do we need to discriminate?
So Coleman Hughes is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he's here to break this down for us and talk a little bit more about this. So Coleman, you know, when people hear affirmative action, there's all sorts of connotations now about it. We're a long way from when it was first sort of created and then implemented. People think, oh, this is going to give less qualified people a break to get into programs. Others say, no, 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 it's just leveling the playing field. But just tell us, what is affirmative action? How is it defined?
Affirmative action is a euphemism for racial preferences, for taking race into account in the confluence of factors that you use to decide whether somebody gets into a school or gets a certain job.
It sounds like a great idea, but since then there's been a tremendous amount of controversy bubbling up around affirmative action. Why has it become so controversial?
Well, a lot of Americans, understandably, including myself, have the intuition that using race to make a decision about who gets into a certain institution is inherently wrong. That feels like the main lesson that was taken away from the civil rights movement. And notwithstanding the fact that affirmative action is very different in spirit from the kind of racial discrimination that has characterized the country's past, white supremacy and Jim Crow, nevertheless, it feels very wrong to people to use something that someone has no control over as a factor that determines whether they get into an institution for any reason, even a reason that is high-minded. You know, some people, critics, hear affirmative action and they think it's contrary to sort of the American dream, which is that you work hard, you get a good education, and you will be rewarded for your stick-to-itiveness. And so when they hear affirmative action, they hear reverse discrimination. Is discrimination an aspect of affirmative action? Well, yes, let's speak very plainly about what we're talking about here. You know, we use this euphemism affirmative action, I think, partly because many people are uncomfortable actually describing it for what it is, right? It's a policy that even defenders of the policy feel a kind of awkwardness talking plainly about it. College administrations have to hide the algorithms they use to decide who gets into a college. There's a lot of secrecy and lack of transparency about how it's instituted because of this baseline discomfort that many people have with using a person's race, which they cannot control, and putting that up to next to things that they can control, like what kind of grades they got or what their SAT score was, or their essays. So putting this variable that they have no control over next to these things that you do have control over, and using that to tip the scale of whether you get into a place. It makes people enormously uncomfortable, and it should. Yeah, you know, I think part of the thing with affirmative action is people want a hard and fast rule or a clearly defined, unmoving description. But the elements of affirmative action are always changing. What is an underrepresented population in one area is not so in another area. What is a disadvantaged population in one area isn't so. So it always has to sort of be evolving for the populations it's dealing with, for the environment, and for the times. The times change as well. And so let me ask you, how has affirmative action worked? Who has it benefited the most? Because we've heard all the studies, oh, affirmative action has actually benefited white women the most. But sometimes, you know, you hear one study and then you stick with that for, I don't know, 15 years, and people really don't do the research. So tell me about affirmative action. How well is it working?
So as you said, affirmative action has meant a lot of different things over the decades. If you're going to talk about affirmative action as it began to be rolled out in the early 70s, that did benefit white women enormously in terms of just getting women into spaces that they literally were not allowed to be in prior. Since then and today, affirmative action most directly benefits sort of the Black elite, let's call it, the top 1 or 2% of Black people in the country that are applying and getting into Ivy League schools, many of whom are the children of immigrants having recently come to the country from West Africa or the Caribbean. You know, by most metrics, this is a class that I'm a part of, and a class that is not actually what people think of when they think of the problem of, say, Black poverty and Black disadvantage. This is not the class that is targeted by affirmative action programs. And so it's very difficult to see how affirmative action is actually moving the ball forward on the issue of racial disparity when it's only targeting really the most elite slice of the Black community, which doesn't really need this help to begin with.
So has affirmative action failed to evolve with the times? Is it still necessary?
Well, I don't think it's still necessary. I think we do need some way of trying to equalize privilege, right? That's a conversation that's very much worth having. But in its current form, race-based affirmative action is mainly about creating cosmetic diversity on campuses and in the workplace, without actually addressing the deep issues that are allowing racial inequality to persist. It can end up hiding
Coleman Hughes really
the fact of inequality without actually addressing it.
Really interesting observations. I know yours is one of many opinions, so this just gives us a window into how interesting this documentary is going to be. Coleman Hughes, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So you can stream the CBSN Originals documentary, The Diversity Dilemma, live on CBSN this Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, or if you don't want to wait, you can also stream it at cbsnews.com/diversity.